that is most critical, not the framework within which it takes place. And I made this point earlier, it doesn't matter whether the distortion comes from China through government intervention or another member. The key thing is that the distortion is harmful to open global trade, to fair global trade, and needs to be addressed in that context for that purpose. So what does the WTO rulebook already do to mitigate the effects of unfair state intervention in commercial and trade activities? On subsidies, the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement outlaws the granting of certain trade distorting subsidies and provides remedies for this. The Agreement on Agriculture, which I mentioned earlier in a different context, seeks to limit or prohibit certain subsidies that distort trade in agricultural products. The Anti-Dumping Agreement broadly addresses distortive pricing practices in which an exporter underprices a product to gain an unfair advantage in another market. The agreement specifically targets conduct relating to enemy effects on pricing. See GATT Article 6 and its additional agreement. The TRIMS agreement seeks to prevent states from imposing certain restrictive measures on investments relating to trade in goods. With respect to state trading enterprises, the WTO permits state trading enterprises, but requires that they function in a transparent and non-discriminatory manner. Against what I've just described, we would be aware that the US and other members accuse China of forced technology transfers and other unfair IP and trade practices. And this ties back to conditions for investment. I mentioned earlier that the TRIMS seeks to prevent activities that would be distortive. And so the argument about forced technology transfer is one that has been made by a number of members in criticism of China's presumed greenlighting of such arrangements, which restrict the ordinary arrangements and agreements between commercial actors. The US and others argue that specific rules and policies discriminate against foreign investors by enforcing certain restrictions on the scope of activities, forcing certain investment obligations, and requiring compulsory sharing of technologies. This is a very interesting observation because all governments have certain restrictive practices, whether for national security or for other security objectives, including food security. So they may limit investments in certain sectors or access to certain sectors. I need not tell students, graduates, postgraduate, that there are cases where the governments of different countries, not just China, have intervened to say otherwise viable commercial and trade activities will be restricted or prevented because of some critical national policy or interest. And especially where these are embedded in national security concerns, they are often seen to be outside of the range or scope of the WTO to address. We saw that, for example, in the cases that would have arisen under the US's attempt to enforce a national security exception for the imposition of certain tariffs on steel and related products. So The specific reference I would make here is that there had been an attempt by a number of members of the WTO to seek consultations with China on the basis that, in their view, through China's domestic legislation, the right to invest in certain areas and to access and operate in the Chinese market was being conditioned through domestic legislation, and that performance requirements, including in relation to technology transfer and conduct of R&D, would have been imposed or allowed or supported by the government of the People's Republic of China, contrary to its WTO obligations. So we have all of these different strands or elements of concern and contest regarding China's non-market economy status. But I think the picture I'm painting is that this is not at all a clear one. And the fact is that despite the contested positions on China's non-market economy treatment, is the Article 15 of the protocol timeline sufficient to end the non-market economy treatment or not? Are the provisions of the WTO agreements relating to state conduct sufficient to address the concerns that exist regarding so-called state intervention and support for commercial practices that are distortive? The question of specific measures regarding public bodies and the role of state-owned enterprises, the question of China's economic model and its impact on trade, continue to be issues that engage different WTO members in critical discussion and, in some cases, critical interventions. One area in which this has evolved is in the debate within the WTO about China's status. Leading members, including the United States, argued that China should no longer designate itself as a developing country and should not benefit from special and differential treatment accorded to countries so categorized. In all of this, the question is, can the WTO impose itself, or can the WTO members impose on China conditions that require a change in its model or its practice by forcible means, whether through decisions of the dispute settlement, were it to be revitalized, or by collective action? Mavroidis and Sapir suggest that the approach should be for a negotiated approach to address the impact of state intervention, including the role of state-owned enterprises in China's trade activities. To address, as a general matter, an obligation to constrain coercive technology transfer arrangements. But their view is that this should be the subject of negotiation and consultation, not pronouncements and declarations. They recommend that new measures should be considered that make it clear that all state-owned enterprises are presumptively public bodies, and thereby reverse the burden of proof in subsidies disputes. That approach should require that these SOEs are compelled to act in accordance with commercial considerations. So this shifting of the burden of proof would require a company to show that it, in its trade and commercial activity, is not benefiting from state support. So the shifting of that burden is the key call in this recommendation. They also further recommend that for foreign direct investment involving joint ventures where an external party is joining with a Chinese partner, the members, and they make it more general, but clearly China would be an important member for consideration in this proposal. Members would be constrained not to enforce contracts between domestic and foreign firms that require the foreign investor to transfer technology to its domestic partner against its wishes. And the last three words are the most critical: against its wishes. And that approach should apply whether in China, in the United Kingdom, in Jamaica, or anywhere else. The idea that commercial actors should freely contract with each other is sacred. And where a party cannot reach an agreement consensually, it should not be coerced by external forces to make that agreement. So the debate on WTO reform, based on my remarks earlier, is unlikely to yield swift and dramatic changes. The positions of members are deeply entrenched, and where the reform is calling for changes to an existing rule or practices allowed by existing rules, change will not come unless the members benefiting from that rule see something to gain from giving it up. It's the old trade-off that is embedded in the way in which the WTO does its work. Who pays for what benefit? It is very unlikely that with the great awareness of members of their rights in the trading system, it is highly unlikely that they will accept reforms that go against their own interests. And so the notion that they will do it for the system, even if it hurts them, needs to be dispensed with. We're not in a period where ignorance is an organizing principle for members in designing their policies and negotiating positions. Finally, the WTO must embrace diversity in its economic models while reinforcing its key principles of non-discrimination, most favored nation status, national treatment, and the maintenance of the balance of rights and obligations among members. It's the conduct and the effects on trade that matter, not the label. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador McCook. And students, now the floor is open. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands or type them in the chat. Okay, I don't see any hands, so maybe I'll first raise one question of my own, and while waiting for more to come. My question is regard to the ministerial conferences that you mentioned, that there have not been much progress made on WTO reform at the most recent two MCs. So what do you think are the main reasons for not so fruitful ministerial conferences, especially with regard to pushing forward the WTO reform? Thank you.
That's a subject, Natalia, for a whole lecture. the simple truth is that the WTO in its more than 25 years has not been able to make significant progress on its core issues. But these are not accidents. These are acts of choice. If members wanted new rules in agriculture, they would be agreed. Reform is really, and organizations are constantly engaged in reform. Every day you look at your program and you try to improve it. The challenge for WTO reform is that it is made more dramatic as an issue because I mentioned earlier the significant failure of the Doha Development Agenda. So when for more than half of the life of the organization, you focus your energies on a goal that you do not achieve, and it collapses spectacularly. You need to go back and ask the questions, why did it fail? And I don't think that the WTO has come to grips with the implications of the failure of its round negotiations. What it has sought to do after that is to go for less critical outcomes. So trade facilitation, for example, is an agreement that supports market access. It supports the core business of trade, which is the exchange of goods. It succeeded because everybody wants to do trade facilitation. But it's harder for a member to say, I want to reduce tariffs, when your domestic producers will say, you cannot do it because you will put me at a disadvantage. So the GATT system made significant progress in agreeing for the liberalization of trade through the reduction of tariffs. But right now, in many cases, average tariffs are either quite low, or the band of high tariffs would be quite narrow. So the ability to reform the WTO to do its core business it's not about the process, and that's the point I would make. It's the outcome. If member states were ready to, if people were seeing benefits in going back to the unfinished business of agricultural reform, non-market access reform, the WTO reform agenda would be immediate. Just change the way in which you organize your meetings, and you get to new outcomes. But the fact is that it's not the way you organize the meetings. It's not the structure of the system. It's the fundamental interests of members that are not changing. So one way in which I think the reform agenda can make progress is in simple efficiency. Do better the things that members are willing to do. And I think that there has been progress around that. But the more critical thing is to listen to members and hear when they say they do not want to do something. And it doesn't require all members. Based on the way in which the WTO makes decisions, if sufficient numbers of members do not want an outcome, it will not happen. And with the way the consensus rule now applies, if a member considers something to be a red line, it's unlikely that that member will grant its approval. So the discussion, and one part of the discussion, if we break down the reform discussion, you have the reform about its different pillars. Dispute settlement reform is now has now been placed in a formal structure. Before the ministerial in Abu Dhabi, it was not in a proper formal structure, it was informal. So if to answer the question about why perhaps the reform agenda of the ministerial would not have been successful, part of it may be in process. But even if the processes were different going into Abu Dhabi, I do not think there would have been a different outcome.
Thank you very much, Wang. And do we have more questions from the students? Please just raise your hands. Yes, I see a hand raised by Lu Wangzhen. Please unmute yourself. 打开那个麦克风。
Hello, Professor. I would like to ask, in the view of the problems you just mentioned about WTO's poor negotiation mechanism and increasingly inefficient decision making, I would like to ask you how you think about optimizing these processes to adapt to the rapidly changing global trade environment, and given the complexity and lack of timelines of the current review process, how should we view improving the WTO's trade policy review process? For example, how to improve this transparency and efficiency? Thank you.
Thank you. Again, a question that could cover a lecture in and of itself. On the monitoring function, I think it's more a question of discipline. I have maintained that a lot of the arguments against a lot of the arguments saying it's difficult to comply with notification requirements are linked to the resource challenges of developing countries. As a practitioner, I tend to see it differently. Most of the data that the WTO requires to be reported has to be captured anyway. Your subsidies reports ought to be timely, because when a government gives support to any sector, it has to account to its parliament in its annual expenditure reports. So in my view, sitting down and saying, how can we simplify the reporting so that instead of creating new vehicles for reporting, the system simply captures information and data that especially less resourced members are able to generate in their regular economic management and activities. So if we focus on addressing the question of the burden of transparency and reporting, are there ways in which the WTO can assist members in drawing the reports inputs from their existing programs? The central banks, for example, capture vital information. The ministries of finance capture vital information. Are they feeding those through the trade ministries in their reporting obligations in an efficient way? The other side of it is the benefit. The smaller you are, the less ability you have to generate research and analysis of external information. So if the WTO gets information on new measures, on levels of subsidies, on tariff levels, in other words, when the reports are provided to the WTO, your experts in your individual member states have a reliable point of reference for doing their own assessments of the rest of the world. So I think that a conversation about how to address the burden and explain and emphasize the benefits of transparency can help. The other approach that some had tried to take, which is to use the big stick, which is to say we will penalize members for not doing so, was not going to go anywhere, because you'd have to have an affirmative decision to adopt those penalties. And nobody is going, what's the gain to a member to say, if I really attach value to reporting, I will do it. If I don't do it, I'm not at risk of a penalty. Why would I put myself under more pressure, not for my own sake, but for the sake of the big picture of the system? That is one challenge. In terms of negotiating, I think my response to Natalia is that the issues that make negotiating outcomes so hard to accomplish is the decided position of a member or members. I don't really see a way of changing that in a democratic scenario, because as long as the WTO remains quote unquote democratic, it has to find solutions by helping individual members to see what is in it for them to agree to something new. And so the negotiating process should largely be about capturing the preferences of the members, the positions of the members, and finding the common denominators, and accept that where a member's limit is reached in terms of what it can agree, you try to build your outcome around where that collective agreement lies. Trying to push for ambition that goes beyond the red lines of a member or members is not a good practice. And accepting that if there's not enough agreement to make an outcome possible, you should abandon the process. So I contend with a similar scenario at the regional level when we are seeking to do things that for 10, 15 years, members will not agree. In my view, when you do not agree, it's not an accident. You do not agree because you have decided not to agree. And the question for the WTO is, what will it take for members who, in a considered way, choose not to agree to something? What would it take for them to agree? Is it to change the proposal, or is it to help the member overcome a hurdle that is preventing them from agreeing? I hope I wasn't too philosophical in my response.
Thank you, Wayne. We still have 15 minutes to go, and do I see any more questions from the students? I know that because I think maybe they still have a lot to learn, because it is such a comprehensive and meanwhile detailed presentation, I think. And I would suggest to read the PowerPoints and then do their own research and to fully digest it. And if I don't see any more hands raised, so I will then give floor to Professor Xu to have some final words, and we will then call the end of this lecture. And if students have more questions, they will be most welcome to raise them to me. And if Ambassador McCook is free, I think maybe he could answer by email. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Xu.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'd be happy.
And before I say my last words, actually, I have a very short question. Yeah. So my question is how the other WTO members see that SOE should or could or may constitute the public body. So we know clearly about the position of the United States, but how the other WTO members think about it. What are their positions? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. The challenge is that we would have known the actual views if the case had progressed and you had third-party interventions from other members who would have sort of like an amicus brief in a case, put forward their views. I mentioned what a highly regarded Professor Mavrodi said about this issue, that really there should be a negotiated approach to how the role of the SOE is managed. I can't say that absent case filings that would put on paper the position of other members. One could say that there is a broad view on how to apply the public body standard to SOEs based on their being SOEs from China. Because in fact, there are state entities engaged in commercial or quasi-commercial activities in every country. And the question of whether they are public bodies for the purpose of trade remedies ought ideally to be determined by whether the conduct of the state body is distortive. And so if it's NASA, for example, well, that may not be a good example because you're dealing with a very sensitive area. But there are public bodies or state-owned enterprises, who are capable of functioning in totally commercial ways. And so I don't have an actual assessment of the wider views of members on the public body determination in respect of, I think, former DDG Alan Wolf. There are a number of people who have written around the issue of public bodies. I'm not myself an expert on it, but as I said, where I would have looked for a reflection of the definitive position of members would have been in third-party filings around the case where they would have made their views known. We also know that in the case of the consultations requested of China, but that was less about public bodies and about the practices relating to technology transfer, etc. But the United States, the European Union, and Japan had very strong views on the role of the Chinese government in certain sectors, whether as direct parties in SOEs or in terms of government policies that caused certain actions to be taken, including arrangements for technology transfer.
Yeah. So actually, SOE is closely relevant to the subsidy issues, right? Yeah. So any new rules that governing the SOE sometimes may created under the subsidy rules. But it's very, very difficult.
And the question is whether the presumption is that by simply being a public company, all your commercial activities benefit from direct government support. And that is not necessarily the case. If a government is a shareholder in a company, but the company's activities are completely undertaken on commercial terms. You raise money at the same rate of interest as other companies. You hire and employ on terms that are consistent with the labor market. All of your activities fulfill the commercial requirements. It would be unfair, in my view, in that case, to apply a penalty simply because the shareholder in the commercial entity is the government.
Yeah. So there are, so under CPTPP, for example, so there are two parallel requirements. So one is the commercial activities, and the other is about the shareholders. Yeah, so they should work together.
Yes.
Yeah, it's quite difficult.
The ownership, in my view, the ownership ought to be distinguished because the ownership by government can lead to a presumption that the government, in seeking to benefit to the greatest extent from the ownership, will intervene in the commercial. But there's also the counterfactual that the government is doing the commercial activity in order to ensure that the commercial processes are fulfilled and that it is not a burden on taxpayers. Because the fact of the matter is that if the government collects revenue and then infuses it into a commercial activity, it's arguable that that is not good business. Because if you're investing in a commercial activity that is not for social or national security or other purposes, you don't want to be taking, in the Western sense, from Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah.
And I think the presumption about the burden of proof, of showing that there is no intervention, commercial intervention from the so-called public body that is distortive, in my view, that is a better approach to dealing with the issue of SOEs in trade.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I still want to see if students have questions. Yeah, it's a very, very good opportunity to speak to experts directly. And actually, the knowledge, the basic knowledge, I have told my students in the class, for example, the Article 15 of the China's accession protocols, and the 15 years of this article and the nature of this article and how it can be applied under the anti-dumping cases and the subsidy cases. Yeah, but they still need time to absorb what you have told, because it's more complex than what I have told them in my class. Yeah. So
it's also more complex than I've described, because that essential question about whether the passage of time under the protocol should lead to a presumption that non-market economy status has expired is the basis on which the contest between those members who have accepted it and the fact is that the members that still contest it are critical members. So it's a big question, and I think when the students will research the statements of the US, for example, statements of the EU, around the Article 15, that will be important. And unfortunately, we don't have the appellate body resolution on that question because the case was not carried. And on top of that, we no longer have the appellate body or a functioning dispute settlement to answer these questions for us.
Yeah, yes, thank you for your suggestions. And it's time for them to preparing their graduated paper. Yeah.
Yes.
So currently they are searching for a right topic.
Yes.
Yeah. So
There are
think
many I think that can turn on, especially given the fact that, as I mentioned at the outset, China represents 15% of global trade and growing. And so assessing what that means for the future of the multilateral trading system is a question that is important for any student of trade anywhere, and certainly in Shanghai.
Yeah. Okay. So since time, is nearly close to our course time, so just to say my thank you to you for giving so detailed analysis of this hot topic. Yeah. So I think the students, they get a lot from your speech. And I hope in the future that we may find opportunities to invite you to visit our university and have face-to-face talk with my colleagues and the students. Yeah, and then travel in Shanghai.
Yeah. In fact, I'm just last week I was in Boa for the China Caribbean Trade and Economic Forum. Met with colleagues from the Ministry of Commerce. So I very much look forward to returning. China is had been for a while my second home when I was ambassador in Beijing. So and I have good friends who have remained in Shanghai, and I'm very, very impressed with the program itself. And I want to wish you and their students all the very best. And thank you for the opportunity that you provided alongside our colleagues from Ledeco, my good friend, Professor Lu, Shankun, and Natalia.
Thank you
very
so
much. Thank you,
Yeah.
Ambassador.
So may I invite all the students to turn on their camera, and then we have a big picture